During the Korean War, the Chinese Communist Army figured out something nobody had ever proven before. They figured out that you could turn an American soldier into a collaborator without torturing him, without beating him, without breaking him, without threatening his family, by using something so small, so quiet, and so universally human that the soldiers themselves never noticed it happening to them. By the end of the war, dozens of American POWs were writing essays praising communism. Some refused repatriation. Almost none had been physically tortured. What the Chinese had done, and what every cult leader, every salesperson, and every advertiser still does, was to use one of the deepest currents in human psychology against them. It's the principle this video is about, and by the end of the next hour, you'll see it moving in your own life. We'll come back to those camps. We'll come back to the soldiers. But to understand what was actually happening inside their heads, we need to talk about a force that runs in every one of us. A force so quiet you almost can't feel it move. A force that, once it's pointed at you, makes you defend a position you only half believed yesterday, as if your life depends on it today. This is part 3 of Robert Cialdini's Influence, the new and expanded edition, the final part of the series, the third and last door. In part 1, we walked through the relationship door, the principles that build a connection between you and a persuader before they ever ask for anything. Reciprocation, liking, unity. In part 2, we walked through the uncertainty door, the principles that take over when you're not sure whether to say yes. Social proof, authority. In this video, we're going through the third and last door, the action door. Because here's the strange thing about persuasion. By the time you've made it through the first 2 doors, the persuader has already done a lot of the work. They've made you feel close to them. They've convinced you about what's true. But you still might not act. You might still hesitate. You might still wait. You might still want to think about it. And the 2 principles behind the third door exist for that exact moment. The moment between deciding and doing. Commitment and consistency say, you've already chosen who you are. Be consistent with that. Scarcity says, what you might lose, you'd better grab now. Both of these principles are intimate, more intimate than any of the others, because by the time they kick in, the persuader is no longer working on your relationships or on your sense of reality. They're working on you, on who you've already decided you are, on what you've already let yourself want. Over the next hour, you'll find out why a divorce attorney's mediation success rate jumped by changing one word in her closing pitch. Why parents who try to keep their teenagers apart usually accelerate the relationship instead. Why 2-year-olds say no to literally everything as soon as they realize they can. And what happened in those Korean prison camps that turned American soldiers into collaborators using nothing more than a pencil and a piece of paper. These are the last 2 principles in the book, the last 2 levers compliance professionals have been using on you. After this hour, you'll have seen all 7, and the world will look a little different than it did before you started watching. Principle 6, commitment and consistency. Every year, Amazon makes its fulfillment center employees an offer. The offer is unusual enough that it has its own name. They call it pay to quit. And here's how it works. Once a year, every Amazon warehouse worker receives a letter from the company. The letter offers them a cash bonus, up to $5,000 if they will resign and stop working for Amazon. $5,000 to leave. No strings, no catch. They take the money, they walk out the door, they never come back. The headline at the top of the letter every year reads, "Please don't take this offer." Now, on the surface, this looks like a strange thing for a company to do. Most businesses spend millions of dollars trying to retain employees, not bribe them out the door. The direct cost of replacing a worker, recruiting, hiring, training their replacement, runs to 50% of the worker's annual compensation. Add in the indirect costs, lost institutional knowledge, productivity disruption, lower morale on the team, and the total is even higher. So why would Jeff Bezos, one of the sharpest business minds in modern history, voluntarily pay people to leave? The official reason the one Amazon spokesperson gives in interviews is that the company doesn't want unhappy workers staying out of inertia. If you don't want to be there, take the $5,000 and go. Better for you, better for Amazon. That's the line. But Bezos himself, in a letter to shareholders, gave a slightly different version. He said the program's purpose was to encourage every employee to, quote, take a moment and think about what they really want, to consider leaving, and then, knowing they could leave, decide to stay. Because here's the thing Bezos understood. The employee who stays after that letter is not the same employee who would have stayed without it. The employee who reads the letter, considers the $5,000, considers the alternative jobs, and chooses, freely and actively, to remain at Amazon. That employee has now made a commitment, a small, internal, unspoken commitment. They have, in their own head, picked Amazon over the alternative. And from that moment forward, every part of their brain that prefers consistency will quietly defend that choice. They will work harder. They will speak more positively about the company. They will be more loyal to their team. Not because Amazon told them to, because they told themselves to, because they had a chance to leave and they didn't take it. And the only way for that decision to make sense is if Amazon is on balance, a place worth working. That's the principle of commitment and consistency. James Joyce wrote, I am today what I established yesterday or some previous day. Once you've taken a position, your mind becomes a defender of that position. It will look for evidence that the position was correct. It will discount evidence that the position was wrong. It will reshape your memory quietly to make the position feel like it was always right. Cialdini cites a study from a Canadian racetrack that proves how fast this happens. Researchers stood near the betting windows and asked bettors how confident they were that their horse would win. They asked half of them right before they placed the bet, while they still had the cash in their hand. They asked the other half right after they placed the bet, when the ticket was printed but the race hadn't started. The horses hadn't changed. The race conditions hadn't changed. The 30 seconds between the two questions hadn't told the bettors anything new about anything. But the bettors who'd been asked after placing the bet were dramatically more confident their horse would win. Same horse, same race, same bettor. The act of placing the money had, in those 30 seconds, doubled their faith in their own choice. Why? Because once you've put money down on a horse, your brain has a small problem to solve. You've just publicly chosen this horse. You've spent your money, you've taken a stand, and the only way for that stand to be right is if the horse is going to win. So your brain very quietly starts believing the horse is going to win. Not because the evidence has changed, because your relationship to the evidence has changed. You might think this only applies to small things. Bets, purchases, trivial choices. It doesn't. There's a study Cialdini describes that took place on a New York City beach. Researchers staged thefts to see whether bystanders would intervene. The setup was simple. An accomplice would put down a beach blanket 5 feet from a randomly chosen sunbather, listen to music for a few minutes, and then get up and stroll down the beach. Soon after, another researcher, pretending to be a thief, would walk up, grab the radio, and try to hurry away with it. Under normal conditions, the researchers ran this 20 times and counted how often the nearby sunbather did anything to stop the thief. The answer was 4 out of 20. Most people just watched. Some looked away. Almost nobody intervened to stop a stranger from being robbed. Then they ran the same experiment with one tiny change. Before walking away, the accomplice would turn to the sunbather and say, "Would you watch my things for a minute?" And the sunbather, of course, would say yes. Just a quick verbal agreement, a favor between strangers on a beach. Out of 20 trials, 19 sunbathers ran after the thief. Some physically restrained him. Some grabbed the radio out of his hands. Some demanded explanations. What had changed? Nothing about the danger. nothing about the responsibility. The only thing that had changed was that the sunbather had said the words, "Yes, I'll watch your things." And once they had said those words, they were no longer ordinary bystanders watching a theft. They were defenders of a verbal commitment they had freely made, and almost all of them, in the moment, would put themselves in physical danger to keep that commitment. That's the force we're studying. A force that turns watchful strangers into vigilantes through nothing more than a yes spoken on a beach. If you want to see how strange this force can get, Cialdini tells a story from his own life that has stayed with me ever since I read it. Back in the early days of his research, he attended an introductory lecture given by a transcendental meditation program, what was at the time a fast-growing organization that promised initiates everything from inner peace to advanced abilities, including at the higher levels, the ability to fly and pass through walls. Tuition for the introductory program was $75. Cialdini went to observe what kind of compliance tactics the recruiters were using. He brought a friend along, a university professor who specialized in statistics and symbolic logic, the kind of friend you bring when you want to make sure nobody gets away with sloppy reasoning. The two recruiters delivered their pitch. As Cialdini's logician friend listened, he became increasingly restless. When the leaders called for questions, he raised his hand and in less than 2 minutes, gently and surely demolished the entire presentation. He pointed out, line by line, where the reasoning was contradictory, where the logic was unsupportable, and where the argument simply collapsed under its own weight. The recruiters were devastated. They tried weak replies. They conferred with each other. They eventually admitted that the points being raised were, quote, requiring further study, at which point Cialdini expected the audience to drift away. He had just watched the whole pitch fall apart. The argument was visibly broken. Anyone with their wits about them would have heard the demolition and walked out the door. Instead, the recruiters were swarmed. Audience members lined up at the back of the room, pulling out checkbooks, paying their $75 on the spot. Cialdini, baffled, talked to 3 of the new sign-ups outside the lecture hall. He asked them why they had paid right after watching the entire program get logically demolished, and the answer he got from one of them has stayed in the literature ever since. The man said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Well, I wasn't going to put down any money tonight because I'm broke. But when your friend started talking, I knew I'd better give them the money now, because if I went home, I'd start thinking about what he said, and then I'd never sign up." Read that sentence again. He paid the $75 precisely because the argument had been demolished. He paid because he wanted to lock himself in before logic could change his mind. These were people with real problems: insomnia, failing classes, a struggling acting career. They had come to the meeting because they desperately needed a solution. The recruiters had offered them one, and then a stranger had threatened to take that solution away with reason. The fastest way to defend the solution against reason was to commit to it before reason could land. Pay the money now, make it real, lock it in. Once the commitment is made, every doubt afterward becomes something the consistency drive will fight against, automatically, without you having to do any more work. The TM audience didn't pay because the program was good. They paid because the program had been threatened. And once they paid, their consistency drive would defend the program for the rest of the time they belonged to it. So the question is, how does it actually work? How does a small commitment grow into a large one? How do you take a person from yes to a tiny thing to yes to something they would never have agreed to on the first day? The answer was discovered, almost by accident, in a quiet residential neighborhood in California in 1966. Section 2. The Foot in the Door. 2 psychologists named Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser wanted to know how far they could push a stranger into agreeing to something absurd. So they sent researchers door to door in a residential California neighborhood, posing as volunteers from a public service organization. At each door, the researcher made an outrageous request: Could the homeowner please allow a billboard to be installed on their front lawn? The researcher would show the homeowner a photograph. The photograph showed a beautiful house, not unlike the house belonging to the homeowner, almost completely obscured by a giant, poorly lettered sign reading "Drive carefully." The sign was ugly. The sign blocked the view. The sign would be on the lawn for an unspecified length of time. Most homeowners said no. Of course they said no. The request was ridiculous. Out of every 100 homeowners they asked, only 17 agreed. 83% slammed the door, politely or otherwise. But Friedman and Fraser tried a different approach in another part of the same neighborhood. Same researchers, same request, same ugly billboard, with one small change. 2 weeks earlier, a different volunteer, they made sure it was a different person, had visited those same homes with a much smaller request. They'd asked the homeowners to sign a petition. The petition was about keeping California beautiful. It wasn't about driving safely. It wasn't about billboards. It was about a vague, feel-good civic cause that nobody was actually opposed to. Almost every homeowner signed the petition. It was a piece of paper. It cost nothing. They wrote their name and went back inside. 2 weeks later, the billboard volunteer arrived with the photograph of the ugly sign. 76% agreed. 3 out of 4 homeowners who would have refused outright 2 weeks earlier now welcomed a hideous billboard onto their front lawn. Now, here's what's strange about this. The petition had nothing to do with the billboard. The petition was about California beauty in the abstract. The billboard was about driving safety. 2 completely different causes, 2 completely different requests. So why on earth would signing a petition about state beauty make somebody 3 times more likely to allow an ugly traffic sign on their front lawn? Friedman and Fraser were as puzzled as you'd expect. They went back through their data and tried to find an explanation. And what they finally landed on is the discovery that founded an entire field of compliance research. When the homeowner signed the Keeping California Beautiful petition, they didn't just sign a petition. They quietly told themselves a story about what kind of person they were. They were the kind of person who acts on their civic principles, the kind of person who supports good causes when asked, the kind of person who shows up. They had, in that one small moment, redefined their own self-image. And 2 weeks later, when the billboard volunteer showed up at the same door, that newly defined self had a problem. The kind of person who acts on their civic principles can't really refuse to host a public safety billboard, not without contradicting the kind of person they had just become. So they said yes, not because they liked billboards, because they liked themselves. And the version of themselves they had to honor was the one that had signed the petition. This is what compliance professionals now call the foot in the door technique. The first request is small. The first request is easy. The first request is something nobody refuses. But the moment you say yes to the small thing, you have quietly told yourself something about who you are. And that self-definition becomes a hook the persuader can pull on for far larger things later. The terrifying part is that the second request doesn't even have to be related to the first. Any small commitment changes your self-image, and once the self-image has shifted, the consistency drive will defend the new image against almost any challenge, including a request you would have laughed at a week earlier. Cialdini gives a personal example of this from the toy industry that has stayed with me ever since I read it. He noticed something strange about his own behavior every January. Every year, in the first weeks after Christmas, he found himself in the largest toy store in town, buying his son another expensive toy. And every year, he ran into the same neighbor in the same store, doing the same thing. He thought it was a coincidence. They laughed about it. 2 grown men meeting in the same toy store on roughly the same week of January, both buying overpriced post-Christmas toys for their sons. What were the odds? Until one day Cialdini mentioned this annual coincidence to a friend who had once worked in the toy business. And the friend just laughed. No coincidence, the friend said. He explained the pattern. Toy companies, he said, have a problem. Sales boom from October through December. Then they collapse in January because every parent has just spent their entire toy budget. Advertising during the slump doesn't help. Discounts during the slump don't help. The parents have already spent the money and they aren't going to spend more. So some clever toy companies came up with a solution. In the run-up to Christmas, they would advertise certain expensive, high-demand toys aggressively, the kind of toys that became the must-have item of the season, the kind of toy your child made you promise to get them. You'd promise. The child would write it on their Christmas list. You'd nod and smile, and then, when you went to the store in mid-December to actually buy the toy, you would discover that the toy was sold out, not because of poor planning by the manufacturer, deliberately. The toy companies had undersupplied the market on purpose. You don't want to disappoint your child on Christmas morning, so you buy something else, something you can find. The child opens it on Christmas, gets over the disappointment, plays with the alternative for a few weeks, and then in late January, the original promised toy mysteriously shows up back on shelves, fully stocked, plenty of inventory, and your child, who had momentarily forgotten about it, sees a commercial for it on Saturday morning television and remembers and reminds you that you had promised. You buy the toy because you said you would, because you're the kind of parent who keeps their word, because you made a promise and you have to honor it. Cialdini, having heard this from his friend, walked back through his memories and realized he had been falling for it for years. The expensive toy his son had begged for in November, the trip to the store in December, the shelves empty, the substitute purchase, and then 6 weeks later, in the same store, the original toy back in stock and his son holding it up triumphantly. His own neighbor, the one he ran into every January, had been falling for the same trick at the same time on the same schedule. Two intelligent adults meeting accidentally in a parking lot, neither of them realizing they had been moved into that parking lot by an industry that had figured out exactly which lever to pull. The toy industry didn't have to convince Cialdini to spend extra money in January. They just had to get him to make a small promise in October. And once the promise was made, the consistency drive did all the rest of the work, on schedule, every January, year after year. That's the foot in the door. A small commitment now, a much larger one later. You'll never see the connection unless somebody points it out to you. But the foot in the door is the gentle version, the version that works because of small civic petitions and Christmas promises. There's another version of the same principle, much darker, that an enemy of the United States used during the Korean War to do something nobody had thought possible, to take ordinary American soldiers and slowly rewrite who they were, without ever raising a hand against them. Section 3. The magic of writing it down. During the Korean War, captured American soldiers ended up in two very different kinds of prisoner of war camps. The North Koreans, who ran some of the camps, used the standard playbook for breaking captured soldiers: beatings, starvation, torture, threats against family. The methods militaries had been using to extract compliance from prisoners for thousands of years. The Chinese communists, who ran the other camps, used something else. They called it the lenient policy. There were no beatings, no torture, no starvation rations. The food was meager but consistent. The medical care was, by the standards of a war prison, decent. The Chinese commanders told the prisoners directly, "We are not going to torture you. We are going to convince you." At the time, American military intelligence couldn't figure out what the Chinese were up to. The lenient policy seemed like weakness. It seemed like the Chinese had gone soft. The prisoners would spend the war comfortable, more or less, and come home unbroken. Except that's not what happened. Something about those camps, something quiet, slow, and almost invisible, was reshaping the American soldiers. By the end of the war, returning POWs from Chinese-run camps were displaying patterns of belief their families and military debriefers had never seen before. Some refused repatriation entirely, chose to stay in China rather than return to the United States. Others came home but spoke about communism in ways that made their commanding officers nervous. The Chinese had done something to these men, and the methods were so unlike anything in the military psychology textbooks that it took years to figure out what. When researchers finally pieced it together, the technique turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple. It was just the foot in the door, carried out patiently over months and years. Here's how it worked. The Chinese guards would gather a group of American prisoners in a hut and announce a small, harmless writing assignment. Today they would say, "Please write an essay analyzing some minor flaw in capitalism." Just one or two, not big issues, not really, just small observable problems with American society. The way every soldier could agree existed, the traffic, the cost of housing, some piece of inequality, some bureaucratic inefficiency, anything. Most prisoners would write the essay without much thought. Sure, some Americans don't have housing, some have too much. Sometimes the trains don't run on time. None of this was controversial. None of this contradicted what they already believed. None of this felt like collaborating with the enemy. Then the Chinese would hold a small competition. The best essay, they would say, would win a prize. Not a big prize, a packet of cigarettes, a few extra rations of rice, a piece of fruit. And this is where the Chinese did something very clever. They didn't pick the most flattering essay. They didn't pick the most pro-communist essay. They picked an essay that was honest, balanced, and slightly critical of America, the kind of thing any thoughtful citizen could have written. They posted that essay on the camp bulletin board with the soldier's name on it. And that soldier, who had won a packet of cigarettes for a small, honest essay, suddenly had a problem. He had just been publicly identified as somebody who could write critically about his country. His essay was up on the wall. His name was on it. He could tell himself it was just for the cigarettes. But here's where the Chinese were diabolically smart. The cigarettes were small enough that he couldn't fully tell himself the essay had been written for the prize. The reward wasn't quite big enough to explain the behavior. So his brain quietly looked for another explanation and found one. He had written the essay because, on some level, he believed it. That single small belief, planted with no torture, no pressure, no coercion, was the wedge. The next week, there would be another essay, a slightly larger one. Analyze a few more problems with capitalism. Compare some specific aspect of life in America to life in China. The soldier, who had already publicly written one essay critical of America, found this second essay much harder to refuse than he would have a month earlier. He had already taken the position. He had to be consistent. And then a third essay, and a fourth, and eventually, months later, small public statements, verbal endorsements, speeches read aloud to other prisoners, letters home that contained subtle references to things the captors had taught. By the time the war ended, some of these soldiers were no longer reliably American. They had not been broken, they had been drifted. Slowly, week by week, essay by essay, into a self-image they would never have accepted on day 1, but couldn't easily abandon by day 500. When American military debriefers tried to figure out what had happened, the soldiers themselves often couldn't explain it. They didn't feel coerced. They didn't feel tortured. They couldn't point to a moment where they had been broken, because there was no such moment. There was just a series of small, voluntary, slightly larger commitments, each one consistent with the one before it. Now, why did this work? Why didn't the Americans figure out what was happening and just refuse to write the next essay? Cialdini identifies 4 conditions that make a commitment durable. The Chinese were running all 4 of them at once. The commitments were active. The soldiers had to write the essays themselves, not just sign somebody else's words. The commitments were public. The essays went on the bulletin board with the soldier's name. The commitments were effortful. Writing an essay takes work, and the commitments were freely chosen. There was no immediate punishment for refusing. The soldiers chose to write because the small reward was technically worth it. All 4 of those conditions stack. Each one strengthens the others. Together they create a commitment that the soldier has to defend, even to himself, for the rest of his life. And here's the most disturbing part. The same 4 conditions are running right now in places you'd never expect to find them. Active, public, effortful, freely chosen. That's the formula for a college fraternity hell week. That's the formula for a corporate retreat. That's the formula for a marketing program that asks customers to share their stories on social media. That's the formula for a cult. None of these are torture. None of these involve coercion. They are technically freely chosen experiences, but they are designed by people who have read this same research to use your own consistency drive against you, to turn a series of small voluntary commitments into a self-image that defends itself against your own better judgment for years afterward. What the Chinese did to American soldiers in 1953 is what social media platforms do to teenagers in 2026. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the speed. If the Korean POW story sounds extreme, like something that could only happen in a war camp to specially chosen subjects in a controlled setting, let me tell you about something that happens every fall on American college campuses. College fraternities and sororities have, for as long as anyone can remember, run something called Hell Week. It's an initiation ritual. New members, pledges, are subjected to a week or more of physically demanding, emotionally degrading, sometimes genuinely dangerous activities. Sleep deprivation, public humiliation, forced calisthenics, memorizing and reciting the fraternity's history under threat of punishment. University administrators have, for decades, tried to ban Hell Week. They have written rules, they have brought in advisors, they have threatened expulsions, they have in many cases succeeded in banning the most extreme practices. None of it has worked. Hell Week, in some form, persists at almost every American fraternity that has ever had it. The rituals adapt, the names change, the harshest practices go underground, but the structure, a week of difficult, public, freely chosen ordeal that pledges have to survive to become full members, has proved almost impossible to eliminate. Cialdini cites anthropological research showing that this isn't a quirk of American college culture. The same structure exists in tribal initiation rites across the world. The Thonga people of Mozambique send boys between 10 and 16 to circumcision school every 4 or 5 years. The boys run a gauntlet between 2 rows of men beating them with clubs. They are stripped of their clothes and have their hair cut. They are circumcised painfully by an elder costumed as a lion man. They spend 3 months sequestered in what the tribe calls the Yard of Mysteries. This isn't sadism. The Thonga elders are not cruel men. The fraternity brothers are not, on average, abusive people. The pledges and the initiates volunteer. They line up, they show up, they want to be put through this. Why? Because they are running on instinct the same psychology the Chinese ran on American soldiers. The harder you have to work to join a group, the more committed you become to that group. Active, public, effortful, freely chosen, the 4 conditions all stacked together. By the time the ordeal ends, the pledge is not the same person who walked in. They have, through their own effort and choice, become a member, and the version of themselves that endured the ordeal will defend that membership against logic and outside pressure for the rest of their life. This is also why the Chinese gave small rewards instead of large ones. There's a study that proves this beautifully. Cialdini cites work by the same Jonathan Friedman who ran the Billboard study, this time investigating whether you could change a child's long-term behavior using small or large threats. Friedman wanted to see if he could prevent 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade boys from playing with a particular toy. Not for an afternoon, for weeks. He took a group of boys, showed each one a robot toy, and explained that it would be wrong to play with the robot. With one group, he made a mild threat. He said, "If you play with the robot, I'll be a little annoyed, just that." With another group, he made a severe threat. Punishment, anger, consequences if they touched it. Then he left the room. Both groups mostly obeyed. Neither group played with the robot in any large numbers while Friedman was watching, but the real test came 6 weeks later. Friedman sent a different researcher to the same boys, in a different setting. The researcher set up the same 5 toys, including the robot, made no threats, made no instructions, simply left the boys alone with the toys and watched. The boys who had received the severe threat played with the robot freely, 6 weeks later, with no qualms. The boys who had received the mild threat did not. They stayed away from the robot. They had decided 6 weeks earlier that they didn't want to play with it, and the decision had stuck. The mild threat had been just enough to keep them from playing with the toy in the moment, but small enough that the boys couldn't tell themselves it was the threat that had stopped them. So their brains looked for another reason, and the reason their brains found was, I don't actually want to play with this toy. I'm not the kind of kid who plays with this toy. The mild threat had given them ownership of the decision. The severe threat had taken ownership away. Those boys could tell themselves the threat was why they hadn't played. The decision belonged to the threatener, not to them. 6 weeks later, when the threat was gone, the decision evaporated. This is one of the most important findings in the entire commitment and consistency literature. If you want a behavior to persist after you've left the room, use the smallest possible incentive that gets the person to comply. Anything bigger, and they will credit the incentive instead of themselves. Anything smaller, and they will, quietly, without your help, defend the behavior for years afterward as their own. But there is one specific deployment of this principle that more than any other will reach into your own wallet this year. It's a sales technique used in dealerships, real estate offices, and almost every high-pressure consumer environment in America. It's so effective that it has its own name. It's called the Lowball. Section 4. The Lowball. Walk onto a car dealership lot in any American city. The salesman who greets you is going to do something specific in the first 30 minutes. He's going to find out which car you want. He's going to ask you a few casual questions about your budget. And then, after a quick consultation with the sales manager, he's going to come back with a number that surprises you. The number will be lower than you expected, significantly lower. Hundreds of dollars below what the same car is selling for at the dealership down the road. Maybe 1,000 below. Now, you've been a careful shopper. You've checked the prices online. You know what this car should cost. And here, on this lot, with this man, the price is somehow much better. You feel something tighten in your chest, a small flicker of what? Luck? Excitement? Whatever it is, you don't want to lose it. So you say yes. The salesman lights up. He walks you over to a desk and starts the paperwork. He asks for your driver's license. He calls his sales manager over to congratulate you. He gets you a coffee. He asks you what color floor mats you'd like. He has you imagine in some detail what it's going to feel like to drive the car off the lot tomorrow morning. You sit there and imagine it. You picture the car in your driveway. You picture telling your spouse. You picture showing it to your friends. The car is, in your mind, almost yours. And then the salesman gets up and leaves the desk for a few minutes. Maybe to print paperwork. Maybe to confer with his manager. Whatever the reason, he's gone. You sit there alone with your half-signed forms and your imagined new car. When he comes back, his face has changed, just slightly. He looks apologetic, embarrassed even. He says, "I am so sorry. I just talked to my manager. There seems to have been a mistake on the price. The actual price is $400 higher than what I quoted you." He explains the mistake. Maybe he forgot a fee. Maybe he misread the manager's note. Maybe he confused this model with a different trim level. Whatever the explanation, the price you agreed to is no longer available. The real price is $400 higher. Almost everyone in this moment still buys the car. Cialdini calls this technique the lowball. It is one of the most effective compliance maneuvers ever documented. And the reason it works has nothing to do with the $400 and everything to do with the consistency drive we've been studying for the last 20 minutes. By the time the salesman comes back with the real price, you are no longer evaluating whether to buy this car. That decision is already in the past. You have already decided to buy. You have already imagined yourself driving it. You have already told yourself you are the kind of person who is buying this car today. The $400 correction is no longer about whether to buy. It's about whether to walk away from the version of yourself who has already bought. And almost nobody walks away, because the version of you who already owns the car is at that moment more vivid than the version of you who hasn't decided yet. The lowball isn't just car dealerships. It's used in real estate when an agent quotes a low commission and then discovers additional fees at closing. It's used in home renovation when a contractor's initial estimate balloons mid-project. It's used in subscription services where the introductory rate quietly becomes the regular rate after a year. Every one of these is the same trick. Get the commitment first, then change the terms after the commitment has hardened into a self-image. But the lowball doesn't only operate in commercial transactions. It operates much more painfully in personal relationships. Cialdini tells a story about his neighbor, a woman he calls Sarah. Sarah had been dating a man named Tim for years. They lived together. The relationship was, by every measure, troubled. Tim drank. Tim refused to talk about marriage. Sarah wanted both of those things to change. Tim said no. Eventually, Sarah got tired of the pattern. She broke up with Tim. He moved out. She started taking calls from an old college boyfriend who'd reached out. Somebody steady, somebody kind, somebody who wanted the same thing she did. Within months, they were engaged, wedding date set, invitations mailed, family informed, and then Tim called. Tim said he'd been thinking. He said he missed her. He said he was wrong. He even said he'd quit drinking if that's what it took. He begged her to take him back. He offered finally to marry her. Sarah was put in a position none of us would want to be in. She had a steady fiancé she had picked for steady reasons, and she had a heartfelt apology from a man she had loved for years. And in that moment, the man begging her was offering her everything she had ever asked him for. He was offering her a Tim who would marry her, a Tim who would stop drinking. She broke off the engagement. She sent back the invitations. She told her old college boyfriend it was over, and she let Tim move back in. Within a month, Tim told her he didn't really need to stop drinking. He had it under control. Within 2 months, he decided they should wait and see on the wedding. By the time Cialdini wrote about this, 2 years had passed. Tim was still drinking. Sarah was still unmarried. Nothing, not one specific thing that Tim had promised her on the night of the lowball had come true. And here's the part of the story that should make your skin crawl. Sarah was more devoted to Tim than ever. When Cialdini asked her how she felt about the choice she'd made, she didn't say she'd been tricked. She didn't say Tim had failed her. She said, "Being forced to decide taught me that Tim is really number one in my heart." After choosing Tim over her other boyfriend, she had become happier, more committed, more sure that she had picked the right person. The conditions under which Sarah had made the decision had never come true. Tim still drank. Tim still refused to marry her. The Tim she had committed to that night didn't actually exist, but the act of choosing him in front of her own life, in the most public and effortful way possible, had created a Tim in her head who was worth the choice. And every day since, her consistency drive had been quietly reinforcing that Tim, the imagined one, at the expense of the real one. This is why the lowball is so dangerous. It doesn't just trick you into buying a car you would have bought anyway for slightly more money. In the right setting, it can trick you into reorganizing your entire life around a choice you would never have made if the chooser inside you had known what was actually being offered: active, public, effortful, freely chosen. Sarah's commitment to Tim that night had every one of those properties. She had told her family. She had cancelled a wedding. She had given up another future. She had made the choice freely, in the sense that nobody held a gun to her head. And the 4 conditions stacked, and the consistency drive locked in. And 2 years later, she was defending a Tim who didn't actually exist against everything in her own life that was telling her to leave. If you've ever wondered why people stay in relationships that obviously aren't working, why people keep funding companies that obviously aren't profitable, why people keep voting for politicians who obviously aren't delivering, this is part of the answer. They are not foolish. They are running the same consistency drive every human being runs. And once a public, effortful, freely chosen commitment has been made, the brain will defend it against almost any contradicting evidence the world can throw at it, which leaves us with the same question we always end up asking. If this principle is this powerful, if it can rewrite a soldier's politics and a woman's heart and a buyer's wallet, how do you defend yourself against it? Cialdini's defense, like always, is small, but it's also, in a strange way, the deepest defense in the entire book. Section 5. The defense. The defense against the consistency principle is harder than the defense against any of the other 6, because by the time you can see it operating, it is already inside you. The commitment has been made, the self-image has shifted, the brain has started defending the new position, and every honest part of you is aligned automatically with the persuader's intentions. You can't reason your way out of consistency by pointing at the original commitment. The brain doesn't experience the commitment as something done to you. It experiences the commitment as something you did because you wanted to. The brain's whole job in this moment is to make sure you keep believing that. So Cialdini's defense isn't a logical defense, it's a physical one. It's a defense rooted in your own body. He calls the first signal the stomach sign. And here's how it works. When somebody is using consistency pressure on you, when they're invoking a commitment you made, reminding you of who you said you were, pointing to a small yes you gave them earlier, your body will know before your mind does. You will feel it, not as an idea, as a sensation, a tightening in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a heaviness across the shoulders, a small voice that says, "Wait, this doesn't feel right." The voice is correct, almost always. The voice is what's left of the part of you that hasn't been captured yet by the new self-image. The voice is the chooser inside you, watching the consistency drive defend a position the chooser didn't fully sign up for. Most of us, when we feel the stomach sign override it, we tell ourselves we're being silly. We tell ourselves we already committed. We tell ourselves it's too late. We push the feeling down and we honor the commitment, because honoring commitments is what good people do. But the stomach sign isn't telling you that you're being silly. The stomach sign is telling you that you are about to honor a commitment that somewhere in you, you don't actually want to honor. When you feel that sign, the move is to stop. Not forever, just for long enough to ask the second question. Cialdini calls the second question the heart of hearts question. And here's how it goes. You stop. You take a breath. You ask yourself, quietly, this exact question. Knowing what I know now, if I could go back to before I made this commitment, would I make it again? Just that. One question. Knowing what I know now, not what I knew when I made the original yes. Would I make this commitment again? If the answer is yes, then the consistency drive is defending something that is genuinely worth defending. Honor the commitment. Buy the car. Stay in the relationship. Continue with the program. If the answer is no, then everything you are about to do next is being driven by your need to stay consistent with a yes you would not give again today. And every step from here forward is going to make the situation worse, not better. The second question is harder than it sounds, because the consistency drive will fight it. The drive will try to hide the answer from you. The drive will rephrase the question in your head as, "But I already committed. Doesn't that count for something?" Or, "But the people I love are counting on this. Can I really back out?" Or, "But I'd look foolish if I changed my mind now. What would they think?" All of those rephrased questions are the consistency drive trying to keep you from hearing the original answer. The original question is, Knowing what I know now, would I make this commitment again? Yes or no? Don't let the drive rewrite it. If the answer is no, walking away, even after you've signed, even after you've publicly committed, even after months or years have passed, is not weakness. It's freedom. It's the chooser inside you finally being heard over the drive that has been speaking on your behalf without permission. Sarah could have walked away from Tim, even 2 years in. The Korean POWs could have stopped writing essays, even on essay number 20. The car buyer could have walked off the lot, even after signing. None of these are easy. All of them are possible. And each one starts with the same two-step move. Feel the stomach sign. Ask the heart of hearts question. That's the whole defense. 2 signals. One physical, one mental. Together they keep the chooser inside you from being completely silenced by the consistency machine that has been running you for as long as you've been alive. And here's what this looks like in your week. Not in dramatic moments, in small ones. You're at a meeting and you mentioned to a colleague last week that you'd be willing to take on a project. Now the project is being scoped and it has tripled in size since the original conversation. Your stomach tightens. Listen to the stomach, then ask the heart of hearts question. Knowing the project is now 3 times what I agreed to, would I have said yes last week if it had been pitched at this size? If the answer is no, you have a piece of information your consistency drive is trying to hide from you. Or you've been going to the gym for 3 weeks and your trainer is now suggesting a longer commitment, more sessions, a higher monthly fee. Your stomach tightens. The trainer points out that you've already invested time, that you've already seen results, that you've already become the kind of person who works out. All of those statements are true, but knowing what you know now, would you sign the longer contract today if you were starting fresh? Or, more painfully, you're in a relationship that has shifted in some specific way. The person you committed to is no longer quite that person. The deal has been changed under you. Your stomach knots repeatedly in moments that should not produce stomach knots. Knowing what you know now, would you make the same commitment again? If the answer is no, this isn't a signal that you're a bad person who keeps abandoning commitments. This is a signal that the version of you who committed had information that the present version of you wouldn't accept. Walking away, even after years, even after public commitment, even after love, isn't betrayal. The betrayal was done to you by a deal that was changed in small ways, slowly, until the original yes was being used to justify a present that the original yes giver would have refused. Sarah could have walked away from Tim, even 2 years in. The Korean POWs could have stopped writing essays, even on essay number 20. The car buyer could have walked off the lot, even after signing. None of these are easy. All of them are possible, and each one starts with the same 2-step move. Feel the stomach sign. Ask the heart of hearts question. Each time you do it, the chooser inside you gets a little louder. The consistency drive, which has been running you on autopilot since childhood, gets a little quieter. And the difference between honoring a commitment that's worth honoring and being trapped by a yes you would not give again becomes, in your daily life, something you can feel. But there's one more force we haven't covered. One more lever, the 7th and last. And of all the principles in this book, the 7th might be the one that operates on you most often, in the most ordinary moments of your week, in ways you'll never quite see until you do. It's the principle that explains why an Apple iPhone launch produces lines around city blocks, why parents who try to keep their teenagers apart accelerate the relationship, and why in 1980 in Miami, an entire population of grown adults started smuggling laundry detergent across county lines. Principle 7. Scarcity. In the run-up to the launch of the Apple iPhone 5, a local TV station sent a reporter to a flagship Apple store in California to interview the people who had been waiting in line all night to buy the new phone. Long lines around iPhone launches were already a tradition by then. People in sleeping bags, camp chairs, blankets, snacks. The reporter was looking for human interest. What did they think about the new phone? What were they hoping for? He approached a woman near the front of the line. She was number 23. She told him she'd been there since the night before. They got to talking about how she'd spent the long hours of waiting. And here's where the story takes a turn that, when I first read it, I had to read 3 times to make sure I understood. She told the reporter that she had originally been number 25 in line. The 2 women ahead of her had spots 23 and 24. Sometime during the night, this woman had started chatting with the woman at position 23. The conversation got friendly. At some point, the position 23 woman noticed the position 25 woman's purse. It was a Louis Vuitton shoulder bag, worth on the resale market about $2,800. The position 25 woman saw the look on her face, and she made an offer. She would trade her bag, her $2,800 handbag, for the other woman's spot in line. The trade happened. The bag changed hands. The position changed too. The woman who had once been number 25 was now number 23. The woman who had once been number 23 now had a new handbag. And then the reporter, understandably stammering, asked the obvious question, why? Why on earth would you trade an almost $3,000 handbag for a slightly better spot in line for a phone you could buy for $1,000 when you got to the front? Her answer was 1 sentence long. She said, I heard that this store didn't have a big supply, and I didn't want to risk losing the chance to get one. Read that sentence again. She traded a bag worth more than 2 iPhones for a marginally better position in a line that was going to deliver an iPhone to her either way, because the store, allegedly, had a limited supply and she did not want to risk losing the chance. That sentence is a perfect illustration of the 7th principle, scarcity. The principle that says, the harder it is to get something, the more you want it. And under the right conditions, the wanting can become so intense that you'll trade away things of much greater objective value just to reduce the risk of losing the scarce thing. Cialdini found a study from Florida State University that demonstrates this in a calmer setting. Researchers asked students to rate the food at the campus cafeteria. The ratings were terrible. Students described the food as boring, bland, uninspired, standard cafeteria fare, nothing memorable. 9 days later, the researchers came back and asked the same students to rate the same cafeteria again. The ratings had completely shifted. Now the students were describing the food in much more positive terms. Suddenly the cafeteria was, well, kind of nice actually. The food was, on reflection, not bad. There were dishes worth coming back for. What had happened in those 9 days? Had the chef been replaced? Had the recipes changed? Had the budget gone up? No. Nothing about the food had changed. Nothing at all. What had happened was a fire. Sometime between the first survey and the second, there had been a small fire in the cafeteria kitchen. The damage was minor. The cafeteria was going to be closed for 2 weeks while repairs were made, which meant the students could not eat at the cafeteria for 2 weeks. The food they had been eating 5 days a week, the food they had been complaining about for an entire semester, that food was suddenly unavailable. And the moment it became unavailable, every student's brain quietly recalculated. The same food, the same cafeteria, the same chef. The only thing that had changed was that they couldn't have it. And that one fact moved their ratings from negative to positive in 9 days. Now this might seem like a quirk of college students. It isn't. Cialdini cites research, eventually awarded the Nobel Prize in economics by a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman, who proved that loss aversion is one of the most reliable patterns in human decision-making. The pain of losing something is on average about twice as strong as the pleasure of gaining the same thing. Twice as strong. That's not a small effect. That's the kind of effect that explains why people make decisions that look, from the outside, irrational. Why a stock investor will hold on to a falling stock far past the point where they should sell, because selling means accepting the loss. Why a gambler will keep betting after a loss, trying to recover ground that's already gone. Why a couple in a failing marriage will keep working on it for years past the point where any outside observer would say to just move on. In professional sports, this principle has been measured directly. Researchers studied PGA Tour golfers and looked at how much time they spent on putts. They found that golfers spent measurably more time on putts to avoid bogeys, putts that, if missed, would push them above par, than on putts to make birdies, which would push them below par. The two situations are mathematically identical. A stroke is a stroke, but the brain doesn't see them that way. The brain treats the threat of loss as more urgent than the prospect of equivalent gain, which means that in any persuasion situation, the persuader who can frame the choice as a possible loss rather than a possible gain has an enormous advantage. Cialdini gives an example from his own life. A friend of his is a divorce mediator. She told him that her negotiations frequently got stuck on small issues at the very end, some final piece of the agreement that the couple just couldn't compromise on, even though everything else had been settled. She would walk into the room with the last offer and say, "All you have to do is agree to this proposal, and we will have a deal." Cialdini suggested she change the wording slightly. Same offer, same terms, different framing. Instead of "agree to this proposal and we'll have a deal," try saying "we have a deal. All you have to do is agree to this proposal." Months later, the mediator told Cialdini the change had been transformative. The new wording, she said, worked almost every time. The reason is the same reason the woman traded her Louis Vuitton bag for a spot in line. The phrase "we have a deal" frames the agreement as something the client already possesses. Refusing now means losing something they have. The original phrase frames the agreement as something they have to earn. Refusing means missing out on something they don't have yet. Same agreement, different frame, wildly different acceptance rate. That's loss aversion. And once you start looking for it, you'll see it everywhere. Limited time offers, inventory countdowns, the only 3 left in stock notice. The phrase "don't miss out," the free trial that auto-renews unless you cancel. Every one of these is exploiting the same circuit. Every one of them is reframing the same decision as a loss instead of a gain. Cialdini cites one example from the travel industry that when I first read it, I had to stop and think about for a long time. The travel booking website, Booking.com, one of the largest travel platforms in the world, at one point had the option of showing customers how many rooms were left at any given hotel at any given price. When the engineers turned this feature on, the conversion rate, the rate at which customers actually completed bookings, instead of just browsing, went up so dramatically that the customer service team called the engineering team in a panic, convinced there had to be a system error. There was no error. The increase was real. Showing customers a small number, 3 rooms left, 2 rooms left, 1 room left, was on its own doubling their willingness to book. Same hotel, same price, same room. The only thing that had changed was that the customer now knew the supply was limited, and the moment they knew, the loss aversion circuit fired and the booking went through. Booking.com kept the feature on. Every major travel site has since copied the approach. Every time you've ever seen the words "only 1 room left at this price" on a hotel listing, you have been on the receiving end of the same circuit the Florida State students fell for after the cafeteria fire. The circuit doesn't care whether the scarcity is real. It cares whether the scarcity is visible. But scarcity has a deeper layer. A layer that doesn't operate just on the things we want, but on the things we are told we can't have. And the cleanest demonstration of that layer played out in 1980 in the city of Miami. Section 7. The band becomes beautiful. In 1980, the local government of Dade County, Florida, that's the metro area that includes Miami, passed an ordinance to protect the local lakes and waterways from environmental damage. The ordinance banned the sale and possession of laundry and cleaning products containing phosphates. The reason was straightforward. Phosphates from household detergents were running into the local water system and feeding algae blooms that were choking the fish out of the area's lakes. Other states had passed similar bans. The science was uncontroversial. The Miami City Council voted, the law passed, and on a specific date, phosphate detergent became contraband within county lines. What happened next was something nobody on the city council had predicted. Within weeks, Miami residents started organizing what they called soap caravans. Groups of neighbors would pile into cars and drive together across the county line into nearby counties where phosphate detergent was still legal. They'd load up their trunks. They'd come back across the county line as a group, like rum runners during Prohibition, with hundreds of dollars of laundry detergent stashed in their cars. Some families went further. They started hoarding. Researchers documented households that were proudly stockpiling 20-year supplies of phosphate detergent in their garages. 20 years of laundry soap. From people who, 6 months earlier, hadn't given the topic a moment's thought. But here's where the story stops being funny and starts being important. Sociologists studied the residents of Dade County after the ordinance passed and compared their attitudes about phosphate detergents to the attitudes of residents in nearby Tampa, where there was no ban. The two groups had, until the ordinance, been using the same detergents and feeling roughly the same way about them. Detergent was detergent. Some brands were better than others. Most people didn't think about it. After the ban, the Miami residents had developed strong opinions about phosphate detergents that the Tampa residents had not. Specifically, the Miami residents now rated phosphate detergents as cleaner, as gentler, as more effective on stains, as better whiteners and fresheners. They even said phosphate detergent poured more easily out of the bottle. Now, none of those things were true. Or rather, none of them had become more true after the ban. The phosphate detergent that Miami residents were now ranking above the alternative was the same chemical compound it had been 6 months earlier. Nothing about its cleaning power had changed. Nothing about how it poured had changed. But in the minds of the people who could no longer have it, the people whose freedom to buy phosphate detergent had been restricted, every measurable property of the product had improved. The detergent had become better, not because it had improved, but because it had been forbidden. This is the second layer of the scarcity principle, and it operates on a much deeper part of human psychology than simple loss aversion. It operates on something Cialdini describes as our most primal reaction to having a freedom taken away. Cialdini cites a psychologist named Jack Brem, who developed a theory called psychological reactance. The theory says, in plain language, when you tell a human being they can't have something, the human being's first response is to want it more. Not always, not consciously, but reliably, almost universally. And the more important the freedom, the more established it is, the more entitled the person feels to it, the harder the reactance fires. It's not just children who do this, though children do it most visibly. It's adults, it's nations, it's entire populations of grown people in suburban Miami smuggling laundry soap across county lines and convincing themselves that the soap pours more easily because it's contraband. The reactance fires hardest when the freedom being restricted is one we already had. When something is restricted that we never had access to in the first place, we shrug. We don't fight for it. But the moment a freedom we previously enjoyed gets taken away, even a freedom we never noticed having, something deep in us rebels, which has implications that go far beyond laundry soap. Consider what happens to information, to ideas, to books, to political views, to everything that can be censored. There's a study Cialdini cites that took place at Purdue University. Researchers showed undergraduate students an advertisement for a novel. Half the students saw an ad with a small line of fine print at the bottom. The line read, "A book for adults only, restricted to those 21 years and over." The other half saw the same ad without that line. Then the researchers asked all the students how interested they were in reading the book, how likely they thought they'd be to enjoy it. how positive they felt about its content. The students who had seen the age restriction were significantly more interested in the book. They predicted they'd like it more. They wanted to read it more. They felt more positive about the content they hadn't even read. Same book, same ad, different fine print. The fine print said, "You might not be allowed to have this." And the moment that line appeared, every student's interest in the book went up. This is why censorship is, for the person trying to suppress an idea, almost always a strategic mistake. The Romans figured this out. The Catholic Church figured it out. Modern political systems keep figuring it out and forgetting it. When you censor an idea, you don't kill the idea, you concentrate it. You tell every person who hears about the censorship that this particular idea was important enough to silence. And every person who hears that wants to know what was being said. Cialdini speculates that when the founders of the United States wrote the First Amendment, the amendment that protects speech, press, religion, and assembly, they may have been operating not just as civil libertarians, but as applied social psychologists. By refusing to ban any political speech, they may have been calculating that ideas allowed to circulate freely would, on average, attract less devotion than ideas the government tried to suppress. They may have been right. The same principle operates in courtrooms. Cialdini cites research on jury behavior. In a normal trial, the rules of evidence sometimes require a judge to rule a piece of testimony or a piece of evidence inadmissible. The jury hears something they shouldn't have heard, and the judge then instructs them to disregard it, to pretend they never heard it, to not let it factor into their deliberations. Researchers have studied this for decades, and the results are unambiguous. When a jury is instructed to disregard a piece of evidence, the jury does not disregard the evidence. The jury weights the evidence more heavily than they would have weighted it if the judge had simply allowed it. Read that again. Telling a jury they cannot consider a piece of evidence makes them consider it more, not less, than they would have if you'd let them. Why? Same reason. The judge has restricted a freedom, the freedom to weigh all the available facts. And the jurors, like the residents of Miami in 1980, like the Purdue students looking at the restricted book, like every 2-year-old who has ever been told no, react against the restriction by giving the forbidden thing more weight, not less. So that's the second layer. The banned becomes beautiful. The restricted becomes more desirable. The censored becomes more believed. The forbidden becomes more compelling. None of this is a logical reaction. It is a reaction so deep in us that to find its earliest manifestation, we have to look not at adults, but at the moment in human development when the principle first appears. And the moment it appears is one every parent in human history has dreaded. The moment the child first says, "No." Section 8. The 2-year-old problem. Walk into a house with a 2-year-old in it and observe for 15 minutes. The child will be told to do something. Pick up a toy, drink some juice, put on a hat, come to dinner, and the child, with no prompting and often with no obvious reason, will say no. Not because the request is unreasonable. Often the child wanted to do the thing 30 seconds before being asked to do it. Not because the child is in a bad mood. The child might be perfectly content. The no comes from somewhere deeper than mood, deeper than logic, deeper than the request itself. Developmental psychologists have a name for what's happening in this moment. They call it the emergence of the autonomous self. Somewhere around the age of 2, a child stops experiencing themselves as an extension of their parents and starts experiencing themselves as a separate person, a person with choices, a person with preferences, a person who can refuse. And the moment that separate self emerges, it does what every separate self in history has done. It tests its boundaries. It exercises its new power to say no, not because no is the right answer, because no is the answer that proves the self exists. This is why parenting a 2-year-old is so famously exhausting. The child isn't being defiant on purpose. The child is, on some quiet developmental level, building the architecture of personal freedom. And every no, every refusal of a reasonable request is a small declaration that the child is somebody separate from you, with the right to have their own answers. The same instinct fires again, in a different way, at age 13 or 14, when the teenager emerges out of childhood and into the boundary of adult selfhood. Every parental request becomes, on some level, an opportunity to assert independence. The teenager doesn't always say no, but the teenager does start to evaluate every request on the question, does this rule treat me like a child or like an adult? Which brings us to a phenomenon Cialdini documents that has, ever since I read it, rearranged how I think about parents and teenagers. He calls it the Romeo and Juliet effect. Romeo and Juliet, of course, were the doomed teenage lovers in Shakespeare's play. Their families were enemies, their relationship was forbidden. Their love in the play becomes so consuming that they choose to die rather than live apart. Generations of readers have wondered how a love that intense could have developed in two teenagers in such a short period of time. Cialdini cites research that may answer the question. A team of psychologists studied 140 teenage couples in Colorado. They surveyed each couple about their relationship. They surveyed the parents about how they felt about the relationship, and then they tracked, over time, how the level of parental opposition correlated with the level of romantic feeling between the two teenagers. The results were striking. As parental opposition rose, romantic feeling rose with it. The more the parents tried to keep the couple apart, the deeper in love the couple got. As parental opposition weakened, as parents gave up or accepted the relationship or stopped intervening, romantic feeling cooled. Parental opposition wasn't suppressing teenage love. Parental opposition was fueling teenage love. Now, this isn't to say every Romeo and every Juliet would have broken up if the parents had stayed quiet. Some teenage relationships have real substance, but the data suggests that, on average, a non-trivial portion of the intensity in a teenage romance comes not from the romance itself, but from the resistance against it. The Romeo and Juliet effect, the researchers concluded, is real. The harder you push two teenagers apart, the more they will fuse together, and the more they will mistake the fusion for love. The same dynamic plays out in adult life. Cialdini gives an example from a small town called Kennesaw, Georgia. In 1982, Kennesaw was a town of about 5,000 people. The town council, in a fit of conservative political theater, passed a law requiring every adult resident to own a gun. Every adult, 6 months in jail and a $200 fine for non-compliance. A small American town, by ordinance, mandated personal firearms. Within weeks of the law's passage, gun sales in Kennesaw exploded. Reporters from around the country flew in to cover the story. National newspapers ran headlines. Gun store owners reported being unable to keep up with demand. But here's the part of the story that didn't make the headlines. Reporters who interviewed the gun store owners about their booming sales got a consistent answer. The buyers weren't local residents. The buyers were visitors from out of town, people who had read about the Kennesaw law in their newspapers and made a special trip into the small Georgia town to purchase a gun. The actual residents of Kennesaw, the people the law was designed to govern, were overwhelmingly not buying guns. The shop owner Donna Green told a reporter, quote, "Business is great, but they're almost all being bought up by people from out of town. We've only had 2 or 3 local people buy a gun to comply with the law. Why? Same reason Miami started smuggling detergent. The Kennesaw residents had had their freedom restricted. They had previously been free to choose whether to own a gun. Now they were being told they had to. And the freedom to not own a gun, which most of them had never thought about before the law passed, suddenly became a freedom they were willing to defend by ignoring the law entirely. Meanwhile, out-of-town visitors, whose personal freedoms hadn't been restricted at all, were perfectly happy to comply with the law as a kind of patriotic gesture. The same law produced opposite reactions in 2 different groups, depending on whether the law restricted their freedom or didn't. This is psychological reactance in pure form. We don't really value the things we choose to do. We value the right to choose, and the moment you take that right away, even with a law we might otherwise have agreed with, something in us starts pushing back hard. You can see this principle running on you in tiny ways every day. The restaurant menu has an item that says limited availability, and you suddenly want it more than the unlimited items. A friend tells you they read a great article but can't share it because it's behind a paywall, and your interest in the article spikes. A celebrity says they're not allowed to comment on a controversy, and you become more curious about what they're not allowed to say. Each of these is a tiny scarcity hook, and each of them in the moment will pull you toward the restricted thing in a way that has very little to do with whether the restricted thing is actually any good, which leaves us at the end of all 7 principles in the book with the same question we always end up asking: how do you defend yourself? Section 9. The defense. The defense against scarcity is the hardest of all the defenses in this book. Harder than the defense against reciprocation. Harder than the defense against authority. Harder even than the defense against commitment and consistency, because scarcity doesn't show up in your head as a thought. It shows up in your body as arousal. The slight tightening of the chest when you see that the iPhone is almost sold out. The flutter of urgency when the sale ends in 3 hours. The catch in your breath when somebody says, "There's only one left." None of these are reasoned responses. They are physiological responses. They are running on circuits that were laid down in human evolution long before any of us learned to count. You can't reason your way out of arousal. By the time you notice it, the chemicals are already in your bloodstream. The sympathetic nervous system has already kicked in. Your judgment has already narrowed. And in that narrowed state, you'll do things you would never have done from a calm starting point. So Cialdini's defense, like always, is small, but it requires something the other defenses didn't. It requires time. His defense is a single question. But before you can ask the question, you have to recognize the arousal, and then you have to wait 5 minutes, maybe 10, for the arousal to fade. Only then can you ask the question and trust the answer. The question is this: would I want this thing, this product, this opportunity, this person, this deal, if it were freely available, abundant, and easy to get? Just that. One question. Strip the scarcity off the offer. Imagine the same thing on the same terms, but with no countdown timer, no limited inventory, no expiring offer, no exclusivity. Strip away every signal of restricted availability, and then ask, would I still want it? If the answer is yes, then the underlying thing has real value to you. The scarcity is just a marketing wrapper. Buy the thing. If the answer is no, then everything you are about to do is being driven by the wrapper, not the thing. You don't want the iPhone. You want the not losing the iPhone. You don't love this person. You love that they might leave. You don't actually need this product. You need the urgency to stop. And when the urgency stops, when the offer expires, when the inventory runs out, when the loved one leaves, you'll be sitting with a thing you never actually wanted, wondering why you fought so hard for it. The defense in practice is to introduce delay, to refuse to buy the limited time offer in the limited time, to wait 24 hours before responding to the urgent request, to give yourself the room to come down off the arousal and decide from a calm place whether the thing in front of you is something the calm version of you actually wants. Compliance professionals know this, which is why every scarcity-based persuasion technique includes a time pressure, the countdown clock, the today-only price, the this-week-only offer, the limited release. Every one of these is designed to keep you from getting the time you need to come down to a calm decision. The pressure is the point. The urgency is the manipulation, which means the defense is to grant yourself the time the persuader is trying to take away from you. Walk away from the dealership, close the browser tab, hang up the phone, tell the salesperson you'll think about it. Give yourself the space to feel the arousal subside. If the offer is real, it'll still be there tomorrow. If it isn't there tomorrow, if the offer truly expired, then you've lost a deal that, statistically, you would have regretted anyway. The data on impulse purchases is unambiguous. Decisions made under scarcity-induced arousal are, on average, regretted at higher rates than decisions made under calm. Walking away from a scarcity offer is, in expected terms, the better play. And every time you walk away from one, every time you let the timer run out and notice that nothing terrible happens, your brain will register that signal. You'll get a little less reactive to the next scarcity hook. The arousal will fade a little faster. The chooser inside you will get a little louder. Here's what this looks like in your week. The countdown clock on a website saying the sale ends in 2 hours. Close the browser, come back tomorrow. If the sale ended, the deal you missed was, by every statistical measure, one you would have regretted at higher rates than the deals you take from a calm head. If the sale is still running tomorrow, and they almost all still are, the urgency was the manipulation, and now you can decide on the merits. The flash inventory notice. Only 3 left in stock. Pause. 3 left in stock now isn't a fact about the product. It's a fact about your moment. Are you actually evaluating this thing? Or are you reacting to the loss frame? If you can't say honestly that you've evaluated it on the merits in the last 15 minutes, you haven't. The early access opportunity, the exclusive invitation, the members-only group. Whenever somebody offers you something with the explicit framing that other people can't have it, pause. The framing is doing work that the offer itself may not deserve. Strip the exclusivity off in your head. Ask whether you'd want this if it were available to everyone. If you would, fine. If you wouldn't, the exclusivity was the lever, not the merit, the relationship that intensifies the moment the other person threatens to leave. The job that suddenly looks great when another company makes you an offer, the vacation rental you can't stop thinking about because somebody else is also asking about it. Every one of these is a scarcity hook. Every one of these is a loss aversion circuit firing on something you may not have actually wanted that badly when there was no threat of losing it. The defense is always the same. Wait, cool down, strip the scarcity off. Ask whether you'd still want it if it were freely available. If yes, proceed. If no, you've just saved yourself a regret you would have paid for, in cash or in years. That's the 7th defense, the last one. And with it, you've now seen, in detail, all 7 of the principles compliance professionals have been using on you for your entire life, which means it's time to take stock of everything you've learned. Key takeaways. You've now seen all 7 of them. 3 videos, 3 doors, 7 principles. Every lever a compliance professional has been using on you for your entire life. Let's pull the whole picture together. In part 1, we walked through the relationship door. The principles that build a connection between you and another human being before they ever ask you for anything. The first principle was reciprocation, the ancient rule that says, when somebody gives you something, you owe them. The reason free samples work, the reason the Amway bougie technique left product trays in strangers' homes for 72 hours and walked back out with money, the reason a Boy Scout sold Cialdini 2 chocolate bars he didn't want, and the reason a woman named Diane Louis walked out of Jonestown alive while 918 people drank the poison, because years earlier she had refused a small favor from Jim Jones and protected her ability to see him clearly. The defense was redefinition. When somebody hands you something, ask whether it's a gift or a sales tool. If it's a sales tool, the debt isn't real. You don't have to pay it. The second principle was liking, the quiet force that runs on 5 engines: attractiveness, similarity, compliments, contact, and association. The reason Tupperware parties built a multi-billion-dollar empire by routing sales through a friend's living room. The reason Joe Girard sold 5 Chevrolets a day for 12 straight years, using one trick: sending every customer a card every month that said, In 3 words, I like you. And the reason Andres Escobar, a Colombian soccer player, was shot 12 times in a parking lot for 1 deflected ball, the defense was to let the liking happen, but to mentally separate the person from the deal at the moment of decision. You'll be driving the car off the lot, not the salesman. And the 3rd principle, the new one, the 7th lever Cialdini added in this expanded edition, was unity, the strangest of all of them. The principle that doesn't work by changing how you feel about a persuader, but by convincing you that the persuader and you are part of the same tribe. The reason a Nazi guard in the middle of an execution raised an eyebrow and shot the 11th prisoner instead of the 10th, because the 10th was from his hometown. The reason Bernie Madoff stole $15 billion from people who should have known better, because they were members of his community. And the reason that asking somebody for advice instead of for an opinion builds connection faster than any compliment could. The defense was the hardest of the 3. Ask yourself when the we was formed, and whether it was formed for a real reason or because somebody manufactured it. In part 2, we walked through the uncertainty door, the principles that take over the moment you've decided you might say yes, but you're not sure whether you should. The 4th principle was social proof, the rule that says reality is whatever the crowd thinks it is. The reason Beijing restaurants sold 20% more of any dish just by labeling it most popular. The reason Sylvan Goldman had to hire actors to push his shopping carts before any real customer would touch one. The reason 5 strangers staring at nothing on a Manhattan sidewalk got 80% of passers-by to stare with them. And the reason airline crashes spike 1,000% after front-page suicide stories, the Werther effect, copycat behavior in its darkest form. The defense came in 3 questions. Is this proof manufactured? Are these people actually like me? And am I leading or am I following? The 5th principle was authority. 2/3 of ordinary Americans in Stanley Milgram's Yale laboratory delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to a stranger because a man in a gray lab coat told them to. A train crew kept moving forward against 3 days of warning and severed Brian Wilson's legs because their orders said don't stop. Then they sued him for the trauma of cutting off his legs. Authority signals come in 3 forms: titles, uniforms, trappings. All 3 are easy to fake, but underneath them, real authority has 2 pillars: expertise. Does this person actually know this specific thing? And trustworthiness. Do they have a reason to mislead me right now? Real trustworthiness shows up, paradoxically, as honesty about weakness. The Domino's executives who admitted on national television that their pizza had been bad, Warren Buffett, who opens every annual report by describing a mistake. The defense was 2 questions. Is this person really an authority on this specific thing? Are they trustworthy on this specific thing right now? And in this video, part 3, we walked through the 3rd and last door, the action door. The principles that take over the moment you've decided you might want to do something, but you haven't yet acted. The 6th principle was commitment and consistency, the hobgoblin in your head. The reason Amazon pays employees $5,000 to leave, because the ones who decide to stay become more loyal afterward. The reason a small petition about California beauty in 1966 made homeowners 3 times more likely, 2 weeks later, to put a hideous billboard on their lawns. The reason American POWs in Korean prison camps started writing essays praising communism without ever being tortured, because the Chinese figured out that small written commitments with small rewards slowly become a self-image too painful to abandon. And the reason a woman named Sarah, who chose her on and off boyfriend over her steady fiancé under pressure, became more devoted to him afterward, even though every promise he made that night turned out to be a lie. The defense was the stomach sign and the heart of hearts question. When something feels wrong, listen to the stomach and ask yourself, knowing what I know now, would I make this commitment again? If the answer is no, walking away isn't weakness, it's freedom. And the seventh principle, the last one, was scarcity. The reason a woman traded a $2,800 handbag for a slightly better spot in line at an iPhone launch. The reason Florida State University students suddenly thought their cafeteria food was great the moment a fire closed the cafeteria for 2 weeks. The reason an entire city of grown adults in 1980 Miami formed soap caravans to smuggle laundry detergent across county lines and started rating the same product as cleaner, gentler, easier to pour just because it had been banned. The reason a Kennesaw, Georgia gun law produced massive non-compliance among locals while attracting visitors from out of town, and the reason juries, instructed to disregard a piece of evidence, weight that evidence more, not less, than evidence freely allowed. The defense was time. Recognize the arousal, wait for it to fade, then ask the question, would I still want this if it were freely available, abundant, and easy to get? If the answer is no, the urgency is the manipulation. The thing itself has nothing for you. 7 principles. 3 doors. 1 unifying truth. Each principle on its own is mostly useful. The reciprocation rule holds civilization together. The liking rule helps you find friends. The unity instinct binds families. Social proof helps you make sensible decisions in unfamiliar situations. Authority helps you defer to people who know more than you. Consistency keeps you stable and trustworthy. And scarcity helps you make decisions when resources are genuinely limited. None of these principles are flaws in human nature. They are features. They are the cognitive shortcuts our species has evolved to make sense of a complicated world without having to think hard about every single decision. They saved us. They are still saving us every day in moments we don't even notice. But every shortcut that helps us is also, by definition, a shortcut that can be exploited. And the people whose entire livelihoods depend on getting you to say yes have spent decades, sometimes centuries, learning exactly where the shortcuts run and exactly how to push on them. Robert Cialdini spent 3 years going undercover in their training rooms to bring you the map of those shortcuts. 7 principles, 3 doors, the whole machinery of compliance, laid out in detail so that you could see what's been moving you all your life. And here's what I want you to carry with you when this video ends. The principles haven't changed because you've watched these videos. They are still operating on you. They are still operating on me. They are still operating on the smartest person you know. Right now, in this moment, while you watch, somewhere a marketer or a salesperson or a politician or a friend is about to push on one of these levers and try to move you somewhere you wouldn't have chosen to go on your own. But now, you'll see it. You'll feel the unexpected gift and notice it's a hook. You'll notice the rising liking and ask whether it's been earned or engineered. You'll feel the manufactured we forming and check whether it's real. You'll see the curated crowd and ask whether it's a sample or a sales tool. You'll see the lab coat and ask whether the expertise underneath it is real and trustworthy. You'll feel the small commitment becoming a larger one and ask the heart of hearts question. And you'll feel the urgency tightening your chest and wait, just wait, until it fades. Each one of those noticings is a moment of freedom. Each one is the chooser inside you, getting a little louder against the principles that have been steering you for your entire life. Cialdini wrote this book to give you those moments. He didn't write it to make you suspicious of every stranger. He didn't write it to make you cynical. He wrote it because he believed that human beings deserve to make their own decisions, with their own reasons, on their own timing, with their own eyes open, and that the world is a slightly better place every time one more person can. And now you can. Closing. So, that's the end. 3 videos, 3 doors, 7 principles. Robert Cialdini's Influence, the new and expanded edition, in its entirety. At the start of this video, I told you about the Korean War, about the prison camps where Chinese guards turned American soldiers into collaborators using nothing more than a pencil and a piece of paper. I want you to think about that story again, now, because it tells you everything you need to know about why this whole series matters. The soldiers in those camps weren't weak. They weren't stupid. They weren't sympathetic to communism when they arrived. They were ordinary American men, exactly like the men around you in your own life. Your father, your brother, your cousin, your neighbor. And what was done to them by enemies who understood the consistency principle better than the soldiers did took them somewhere they would never have chosen to go on their own. The same machinery was operating on Diane Louis inside Jim Jones's compound until she refused a bowl of soup. The same machinery was operating in Manhattan when 5 strangers got 80% of passers-by to stare at nothing. The same machinery was operating in a Yale laboratory when ordinary teachers and lawyers and accountants delivered what they believed were lethal shocks to a stranger because a man in a gray lab coat told them to. You will run into all 7 of these principles this week. They are running on you right now, in this moment, in ways neither of us can fully see. But the next time one of them moves you toward a yes you'll regret, you'll feel it pulling. And feeling it is the whole game. If you want to go deeper, the full book, Influence, the new and expanded edition by Robert Cialdini, is on Amazon and on Audible. The links are in the description. Every chapter contains stories and research that I had to leave out across 3 full-length videos just to keep things at a reasonable length. Read it, listen to it, or both. It is one of the most important books written in the 20th century, and the new edition is even better than the original. And here's the question I want to leave you with. Of the 7 principles you've now seen, reciprocation, liking, unity, social proof, authority, commitment and consistency, scarcity, which one do you think has had the biggest pull on the person you've become? Not the obvious things, the small ones, the choices you didn't know were choices, the yeses that quietly built the life you're in. Drop it in the comments. I read every reply, and after 3 full-length videos covering this material, I'm genuinely curious what landed for you. If you've made it through all 3 parts, thank you, genuinely. That's 9 hours of attention you've given to one book, more than most people give to anything that isn't a Netflix series. Subscribe so I can do this for the next book. There are a lot of books. There are a lot of forces operating on us, and the more of them we can see, the more of our lives we get to actually choose. Until next time, see clearly, choose freely, and don't trust the urgency. Thank you for watching.